Okay. So our Torah portion this week is Tazria on 649 in the Eitz Chaim, or chapter 12 of Leviticus in whatever edition you have. And I'll start with the blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And even before we get into Tazria, and you'll see if you're in the Eitz Chaim, you'll see a lengthy commentary below the line there on 649, which we will get to. I just want to point out something logistically about what's happening in synagogue on Shabbat with reading Torah, because it's one of the few occasions where we will be taking 3 Torah scrolls out of the Ark to read from. So I wanted to spend a moment just to talk about that. The public reading of the Torah every Shabbat began as a practice by the rabbis 2,000 years ago. So it was not so common when in synagogue, when the temple was standing in Jerusalem. I mean, that was the transition time between Israelite sacrifice in the temple and alternative prayers that could be recited in the synagogue. So while the temple was still standing, clearly everyone agreed, including the rabbis, that the ideal form of worship is the sacrificial system described here in the Torah and carried out in the temple in Jerusalem. As the transition was happening, and then dramatically when the temple was destroyed, the synagogue took the place of the temple, as we know, and the weekly reading from the Torah became a standard part of the liturgy. So I can't tell you exactly how this happened, when it happened. We know in the Torah that once every 7 years, the community is supposed to gather during the holiday of Sukkot to hear the king read the Torah. So that's all the Torah has about public reading of the Torah, once every 7 years. The book of Ezra describes the Israelites returning from exile in Babylonia to the land of Israel. So this is around the 6th century BCE. And there, it seems like he instituted the weekly reading of the Torah. But again, it's unclear from the book itself, or this is a tradition that the rabbis ascribed to Ezra, so that the rabbis aren't seen as making up this practice themselves. So the reading of the Torah every week is a rabbinic innovation, and that the cycle begins and ends on the holiday of Simchat Torah, and certain portions have to fall at a particular date in the calendar. So for example, the book of Deuteronomy always begins on the Shabbat before the fast day known as Tisha B'Av. So when we read from the Torah, one of the factors in determining whether a Torah portion is going to be doubled or not is to make sure that the book of Deuteronomy, the portion Deuteronomy, the first portion in the book of Deuteronomy happens on the Shabbat immediately preceding Tisha B'Av. Also, the book of Numbers almost always begins on the Shabbat before Shavuot. There are times when that's not the case, but over 90% of the time, the book of Numbers begins on the Shabbat immediately before Shavuot. So those are a couple of some of the logistics in planning the cycle of Torah reading and what Torah portion is going to be read on what Shabbat. so that it fits with the calendar. So now we also know that when there's a special occasion on Shabbat, that special occasion may or may not determine what is read from the Torah. So for example, the first day of Passover this year, Shabbat, April 16th, is a Shabbat, right? The first Seder is Friday night, April 15th. So the first day of Passover is on Shabbat. So that Shabbat, we do not read from the normal cycle of weekly Torah readings. Instead, we read what is designated for the first day of Passover. Okay, so the rabbis determine not only what's read on Shabbat, but also what's read on the holidays and other sacred occasions. Okay, so they determined what the reading would be on the first day of Passover. The last day of Passover outside of Israel, the 8th day of Passover, is also Shabbat, Shabbat, April 23rd. So that also will not be a regular Shabbat Torah reading. It'll be the reading for the 8th day of Passover. However, in Israel, there are only 7 days of Passover because the Torah says 7 days of a holiday. Outside of Israel, there are 8 days of a holiday. So in Israel, there is no 8th day of Passover. It is a regular Shabbat. So that regular Shabbat Torah reading is going to be different from our Shabbat Torah reading, which is the 8th day of Passover Torah reading. So that the next Shabbat, which isn't Passover for anybody, it's April 30th, the Torah reading that's going to be read in Israel will be different from the Torah reading that will be read outside of Israel. And we'll catch up in time for Shavuot. Okay, so there are times when Israel and outside of Israel, the Torah readings on Shabbat don't match because of what a circumstance like this year. Okay, so holidays have their own Torah readings, and they outweigh the regular Torah reading that would happen on that Shabbat. Okay, that's one thing. If it's Rosh Chodesh, as it is this coming Shabbat, we take out another Torah scroll to read the special offering that was brought in the temple for Rosh Chodesh. And so when it's an occasion like that, you take out another scroll. So on Shabbat, that is Passover, the first day of Passover, we have 2 scrolls. One to read the Passover offering, but what we're supposed to read about Passover from the first scroll, and then to read from the book of Numbers the special offerings brought on the first day of Passover. On Rosh Chodesh, that same chapter in Numbers has a description what's brought on Shabbat, what's brought on Rosh Chodesh, the new month, to bring as a special sacrifice. So that we read from the second scroll. Now, this Shabbat is also one of the special Shabbases between the beginning of the month of Adar and Passover. This Shabbat is known as HaChodesh. So always the Shabbat immediately preceding Rosh Chodesh Nisan, or if it is Rosh Chodesh Nisan, as it is this coming Shabbat, then that Shabbat is known as HaChodesh. And we read chapter 12 of the book of Exodus, the first 20 sentences, which describes the preparation for the very first Passover in Egypt. HaChodesh hazeh lachem Rosh Chodashim. That's how the chapter says it in chapter 12 of Exodus. This month is the beginning of all months for you, and this is what you have to do. Moses goes on in God's name to tell the people of Israel, take a lamb or a goat, set it aside for Passover. The blood will be taken, put it on the doorposts of your homes to protect from the plague of death of the firstborn, and then roast that lamb or goat and eat it quickly to prepare to leave Egypt. So that the Shabbat always before the new month of Nisan, or if it is the new month of Nisan itself, has that special reading from another Torah. So we have 3 Torahs this Shabbat for the weekly Torah portion, Tazria, because it's Rosh Chodesh, the portion from the book of Numbers of Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, and because it's a special Shabbat before Passover, the reading from the book of Exodus. So 3 Torah scrolls. There are 3 other occasions when 3 Torah scrolls can be taken out. One would be Shabbat Shekalim, which is always the Shabbat immediately preceding Rosh Chodesh Adar, or if it is Rosh Chodesh Adar, then you'd have that weekly Torah portion, then the Shabbat Rosh Chodesh portion, and then the Shekalim portion. Sometimes Shabbat of Hanukkah is also Rosh Chodesh, so there would be 3 Torah scrolls for that Shabbat. And then Simchat Torah, we also read from three Torahs. We do it from 2 Torahs instead of 3, because we actually unroll the entire Torah around the sanctuary and then roll it back to Genesis. But if we didn't do that, we'd have one Torah scroll for the end of the book of Deuteronomy, another Torah scroll for the beginning of Genesis, and then the 3rd Torah scroll for because it's a holiday, Simchat Torah, from the portion in the book of Numbers. So those are the occasions when there could be 3 Torah scrolls taken out of the ark. Now, not every synagogue has 3 Torah scrolls, and if that's the case, then the congregation has to sit tight while one of the Torahs is rolled to the appropriate portion. So those synagogues that don't have 3 Torah scrolls, we're fortunate to have 9 in the ark in our sanctuary, plus another 2 in the ark in the chapel, to be able to cover all circumstances like this. Okay, so that I just wanted to get to the logistics about how with the 3 Torah scrolls. So now, if we turn to 649 and Eitz Chaim, or which is chapter 12 of the book of Leviticus, we'll see the introduction to this week's portion. I want to read from the Hebrew first, the first few verses of the portion, and to understand why there's such lengthy commentary on the page. Okay, Vayedaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, God spoke to Moses saying, 650, verse 2, Daber el bnei Yisrael, Daber el bnei Yisrael lemor, speak to the people of Israel saying, Isha ki Tazria, a woman becomes pregnant. So I think Tazria, I want to translate it as literally as possible. Here in the English, it says, when a woman at childbirth bears a male. Isha ki Tazria. So Zerah is seed. So Tazria, I think, bears a seed. I think what might mean to conceive. When a woman conceives, and then v'yalda zachar, and gives birth to a male child. Okay, v'tam'a shivat yamim, she becomes impure for 7 days. Ki yemei nidat devota titma, she shall be impure as at the time of her menstrual infirmity. Okay, so it's assuming that we know that a woman is impure at her menstrual infirmity, and then tells us that when she gives birth to a male child, she is impure for 7 days. Okay, we haven't talked about a woman in her monthly cycle before in the Torah. So it's interesting that the portion here just assumes that we know about it. Okay. Now, so is that true that we haven't talked about it before? Yeah, I think that because the other portions, Vayikra and Sav, talk about sacrifices that would be brought, and I don't think it has it mentioned anything about impurity, like the monthly cycle. So, yeah, so I think this is just assuming that we know about this. Okay? And then, so it goes on, we'll go on a couple more sentences. Uvayom hashmini, and on the 8th day, so 7 days she's impure. On the 8th day, yimol basar orlato. The flesh of his foreskin will be circumcised. Ushloshim yom ushloshet yamim, and for 33 days, teshev b'demei tahara. She shall sit in the blood of her purification. Bechol kodesh lo tigash, she should not touch anything sacred or holy. Ve'el hamikdash lo tavo, and to the sanctuary she should not enter or approach. Ad milot yemei tahara, until the days of her purification have been fulfilled or completed. Ve'im nekeva teled, and if she gives birth to a girl, V'tam'a shvu'ayim kinidata, she would be impure for 2 weeks. V'shishim yom v'sheshet yamim, and for 66 days, teshev al demei tahara, she should sit in her blood of purification. And then we'll just finish chapter 12. Uvim lot yemei tahara, when her days of purification have been complete. Verse 6, Levain olavat, for a boy or a girl, or son or daughter, Tavi keves ben shnato leolah, she should bring a year-old sheep for offering, for a burnt offering, u ven yonah otur lechatat, and a pigeon or a turtle dove as a sin offering. El petach ohel moed el hakohen. She should bring the sheep and the bird to the entrance to the tent of meeting, to the Kohen. Okay, so every time you give birth, you bring a lamb, a year-old lamb, and a bird for a burnt offering and for a sin offering, respectively. Vehi krivo lifnei Adonai, and he, the Kohen, will offer it before God, v'chiper aleha, and will atone for her, v'tahara mimakor dameha, and she'll be purified from the source of her blood. Zot Torah hayoledet, this is the law of the woman who gives birth, l'zachar olenakeva, for a boy or a girl, or more technically, for a male or a female. The imlotim sayada dese, and if she cannot find, if her hand cannot find a sheep, vilakha shte tarim, she should take 2 turtle doves, 2 pigeons, or shne b'nei yonah, or 2 turtle doves, echad la'olah ve'echad lechatat, 1 for the burnt offering, 1 for the sin offering. V'chiper aleha hakohen v'taheva, and the Kohen would atone for her, and she would become pure. Okay, 66 days of it, 2 weeks plus 66 days of impurity for a girl if she gives birth to a girl, 1 week and 33 days of impurity if she gives birth to a boy, a sheep, a lamb and a bird, or 2 birds for a burnt offering and a sin offering as expiation and purification after the birth process. So what comes to mind, before we read the commentary here, what comes to mind about this, about these sentences? What's your reaction to reading these sentences about this spiritual purification and impurity related to childbirth? Any thoughts or comments about it before we read the commentary?
The most striking thing is the difference between the boy and the girl.
Okay, right. That's one obvious thing. There's a big difference between the birth of a boy and the birth of a girl. Okay, that's one thing. And it doesn't explain why at all, what the difference is. Okay, so we'll look at the commentary to see, and that's just a suggestion in the commentary because the Torah doesn't tell us. What
I
else?
also wonder,
Yeah.
why is it that after a birth, there would be a sin offering?
Exactly.
I get like there could be an offering, thank you, this miraculous thing. Thank you. This is
Right.
wonderful. I want to praise God that this all worked out well.
Right.
But I'm confused about why it would be a sin offering.
Exactly. Exactly. And the very first commandment in the entire Torah is to be fruitful and multiply.
So that's why
we're-
that doesn't make sense
Right, exactly.
to me.
I agree. I agree that the Torah commands us, God commanded us in Genesis to be fruitful and multiply, and commanded us that whenever a boy is born on the 8th day, he should be circumcised. So childbirth is commanded to do. So what is the sin in fulfilling that?
And if you don't have children, then your people die out because you need to.
Exactly.
It's the natural order that older people pass on.
Exactly.
But if you don't have younger people to replace, then your people die out, no?
Right. Exactly right. So yes, questions. These are legitimate questions. Why should there be a difference between a boy and a girl in terms of the amount of time? Childbirth is childbirth. There's nothing different in the birthing process of a boy or a girl, right? Sometimes, so today with modern science, you know what you're having ahead of time, but still it doesn't matter. It's not like, you're having a girl. So we have to go through these procedures in order to do labor and childbirth. Oh, you're having a boy, so we do these procedures. No, it's the exact same procedures, right? Both boy and girl are attached with the umbilical cord. You cut the cord, right? Nothing else is done differently. So there's nothing about that, and nobody knew until a few years ago. It's more than a few years ago that you can know ahead of time what you're having. But still, before sonograms and genetic testing, nobody knew what they were having. So there's nothing different in the birthing process of a boy or a girl, and nothing different as far as we know in the conception process either, in determining that. It's just random, the XY chromosomes, et cetera. So anyway, why the difference, and why the sin offering? You can understand, and also what is there to atone for? So there's a sin offering, and what's there to be purified from? Why should a woman, so not just bring a sin offering, what about it is impure? Okay, and what
impure part I understand, I think, because if during the process of childbirth there's blood, then we go back to the blood thing.
Right. But so let's by going back to that, what is impurity? And this concept of purity and impurity, it's a new concept that the Torah is bringing out to us here in Leviticus that we haven't really seen before, right? We've touched on it in terms of the Kohanim needing to be anointed, and they need to be consecrated to prepare to work in the Mishkan. So the end of the book of Exodus alludes to this concept of sanctification, but a sense of purity and impurity, tahor and tameh, we haven't really approached before.
Is there any connection to just like when you sleep, you're technically like 1/60th dead? is there anything that, like, after childbirth that, maybe because, especially in those times, it was kind of a dangerous thing
Right.
that
So
maybe, it was thought that someone was kind of
the
possibly
Torah,
close to death? I'm reaching. I
yeah,
don't
no,
know.
there's no reach. There's no reach because the Torah doesn't explain why. It just assumes we know. It assumes we know that a married woman once a month, that bleeding is called nidah in Hebrew, and that is impure. And it assumes we know what the concept of tahor and tameh is. It doesn't explain. It doesn't define for us what tameh and tahor is. It also, by the way, doesn't define for us what work is that we're supposed to refrain from on Shabbat. Okay, so in the 10 Commandments, in the fourth commandment about observing Shabbat, you're supposed to refrain from all manner of work, but it doesn't tell us exactly what work is. So it's left to the rabbis to define work on Shabbat, and it's also left for the rabbis to define what pure and impure, what tahor and tameh means. Also for them to define what kadosh, what holy or sacred means. Okay, so that's why this lengthy commentary on 649 is here to explain to us about this concept of tahor and tameh, because the next thing after childbirth that this portion is going to talk about are these unusual skin rashes. That's chapter 13, that might appear on our skin, and how the Kohen would have to be brought in to help in the purification process. Okay, so blood is associated with purity and impurity, and skin rashes are associated with purity and impurity. So just this whole bizarre concept is what the below the line commentary is attempting to talk about and make relevant to us. Okay, because all right, so let's just look at the commentary and let's see. After the previous chapter's discussion of how food entering our bodies can make us ritually impure, the Torah now discusses how that which comes out of our bodies can do the same. Perhaps no concept in the Torah is less accessible to the modern reader than the notion of tum'ah, generally translated uncleanness. And I would say also the opposite, the positive, tahara, or purity. Okay, so these are just unusual concepts and not accessible to us, because the idea that we are impure is obviously it has negative connotations to it, and that anybody who is impure would, like the Torah describes here, someone with the skin rashes, has to be set aside from the rest of the community. Okay, now there's a play that has been playing at the Olney Theater called AD 16. It's a musical that may be ending up on Broadway. It's about Jesus and the supposed relationship that he had with Mary Magdalene. So there is one part of the play talks about the community of those afflicted with these skin rashes. It's commonly translated as leprosy, but it's not leprosy as we know it, but it's just easier to translate it as leprosy. So there's a leper colony that's outside the particular village where Jesus and Mary Magdalene are, and Jesus's work with the lepers in terms of charitable work, providing food for them, etc. So those who are slated, who are determined to be impure, are to be isolated. So a married woman once a month is always impure. So she's not allowed to come into contact with anyone else during those days of impurity, and then she goes to the mikveh to become pure. Someone afflicted with a skin rash is set aside outside the community and has to be constantly checked. And once completed and the skin rash goes away, also go to the mikveh, as well as other offerings to bring as well. So these are just in our day today. No, we just don't use these concepts of pure and impure and we don't check. The closest to it is checking a vaccination card, right? So some places that check the vaccination card, this would create a scenario in which some are accepted, you pass the health test, and some are not. You cannot come in, okay? So that is the only thing in modern times that can give us a sense of what it means to be labeled as impure, or tameh in Hebrew, okay? So there's no vaccination card, there's no, there's people either as a leper, someone with a skin rash, the Kohen diagnoses them, and then they go off and live separately. Otherwise, a married woman might act differently during those 7 days in which she is impure every month, and people know to stay away, or at least ensure that they don't touch, because the impurity spreads. So there's confusing elements to the purity impurity that are similar to contagion and sanitation and health and bacteria and virus. Religiously, it's not similar. So in other words, there's nothing that you do that can cure yourself of ritual impurity. It just stops on its own, right? With the childbirth, it's 1 week and 33 days for a boy, 2 weeks and 66 days for a girl. That's then the end of your impurity. So it's not like you've taken antibiotics and you take the antibiotics for the boy, or you take the antibiotics for a girl, and then you're cured of the girl-boy birth impurity. No, it's not like that. So we shouldn't confuse the purity and impurity with sanitary, with cleanliness or with hygiene. It has nothing to do with that. It's all spiritual. It's a spiritual purity, and that's a concept that is difficult. I mean, we can understand an idea of wanting to grow spiritually in our practice and in our connection to God, so that we might adopt spiritual practices that might enhance our religiosity. We can understand that. Would that make us purer or less pure than other people? No, we're just on a different level, or we're climbing the spiritual ladder in a different way than other people are. But would it be appropriate to label people as less pure or more pure than others? It's just something that we just don't do. Physical defects. Do physical defects, physical disability, mental disability make us pure or impure? Well, if you're a Kohen, it does. We'll read in a few more chapters about if you have a physical or a mental defect, it can disqualify you from working in the Mishkan. So there are elements that we take for granted in life today about being welcoming and inclusive and open to all that were not part of the Torah. And the Torah actually did impose restrictions on those who could approach the sanctuary and those who could work in the sanctuary. And those restrictions relate to sanctity and purity. Okay, so it's a whole different way of understanding religion. Okay, so it's been 2,000 years since the temple was destroyed, when these practices now no longer exist, and this sense of distinction in the community just isn't there anymore. So it's hard for us to understand, and that's what the commentary means. That this is could be what do they say? No connection. Okay. Is less accessible. That's the first sentence of the second paragraph. Okay. One contracts tum'ah. I'm continuing now in the second paragraph. One contracts tum'ah, impurity, through contact with a dead body, or by being afflicted with sara'at, that's the leprosy, or by contact with a bodily emission that touches on the generation of life, such as menstrual blood, semen, or flow from the reproductive organs. A woman who has just given birth is likewise considered ritually impure. Tum'ah bars one from approaching God's sanctuary. Sara'at isolates one from human contact. Okay. Tum'ah has unmistakable negative connotations. It is defined by what one may not do, and the Torah tells us how to be relieved of it. It need not, however, imply wrongdoing on the part of the affected person, right? We shouldn't associate impurity with anything the person has done wrong. And back to the point, what has the woman done wrong in giving birth to a child? What is the sin? Admittedly, in parentheses, as some commentators have noted, the Torah itself provides a basis for that interpretation when it calls for a purification offering to be part of the prescribed process of reintegration. Purification, but also it's a sin offering. The woman brings a sin offering. That lamb or a bird, if she can't afford a lamb, is a sin offering, plus a burnt offering bringing as well. So sin implies wrongdoing. Tum'ah seems to be the result of coming in contact with an awesomely potent force that disqualifies one from approaching the sanctuary. Proof that tum'ah is not a totally negative condition can be found not only in its association with such religiously affirmed activities as childbirth and caring for the dead, right? It's a mitzvah to be part of the holy society that cares for the dead, but also from the rabbinic rule that scrolls of the biblical books convey tum'ah to those who touch them, right? One is not supposed to touch the Torah scroll because the Torah scroll illogically conveys impurity. It would make one impure if you touch it. So that's parentheses, this finds its extension in the efforts we make today to avoid touching the Torah scroll with our bare hands, using a pointer when we read from it, and a mantle when taking it from the ark and returning it. All right, so the Torah scroll, which we would imagine would be the most sacred and pure of all objects, illogically is defined by the rabbis as makes one impure when touching it. All right, so perhaps also to highlight the sense that treat it with care. It has been suggested that these categories of ritual impurity were a response to the anxiety triggered by death, serious illness, and the leaking of life-generating fluids from the body. Okay, this could be one idea, because we have no idea, so this is one possible interpretation. It has been noted further that natural flows require less purification than unnatural flows, which might indicate the presence of disease. Right, the unnatural flows from the body or the unnatural skin rashes makes one impure for longer. Okay, although tum'ah bars a woman from the sanctuary, We need not see that condition as negative and certainly not as a punishment. Okay, here are egalitarian rabbis writing a commentary to try to make something that is clearly sexist in the Torah, right? Give birth to a girl, you're impure 2 weeks plus 66 days. Give birth to a boy, it's 1 week, 33 days. Why more for a girl than for a boy? Implying there's something wrong with a girl and something better about a boy. So now the egalitarian commentators have to try to rectify that. No, don't think the Torah is sexist. There is no reason to believe, the commentary goes on, that God ordained menstruation or childbirth as a punishment. We might postulate that there are two types of holiness in life, two ways of encountering the divine. There is a natural holiness found in the miracles of pregnancy, birth, and recovery from illness. And there's a stipulated holiness, the arbitrary designation of certain times, places, and activities as sacred. One meets God in the experiences of birth and death, sickness and health, but they are not everyday occurrences. The person who yearns for contact with God on a regular basis must rely on sanctuaries, worship services, and prescribed rituals, all of which are holy only because we have chosen to designate them as holy. Israelite society may have seen the two types of holiness as being mutually exclusive, so that it would not be appropriate for the woman or man who had encountered the vital holiness of childbirth, menstruation, or contact with the dead body to seek the designated holiness of the sanctuary. I would just say about this, man did not choose the sanctuary to be holy. God did. God commanded the building of the Mishkan. God commanded the subsequent building of a house, a permanent house in the place that God chose, the temple in Jerusalem. So it's God's house, and then these are God's rules for entering God's house. So that's how I would see it. And so therefore, the Torah provides very strict rules on that, with this concept of physical holiness, of physical fit, being spiritually, physically fit. Not physically fit like you've exercised and eating well. I don't mean physically fit that way. I mean spiritually, physically fit. That everything is working okay in your body to allow you to then be in potentially spiritually fit to enter the sanctuary. And you're not spiritually fit when you have these occurrences of impurity, whether you've come into contact with the dead, or something is you've come into contact with a person who's impure, or you yourself are impure. Okay, so it's an ancient way of understanding that if we have God's house, then therefore there has to be a certain expectation that if you enter God's house, then you have to be as holy as possible. So the holiness isn't just about how we act when doing social justice and observing the rituals and practices of Judaism, but it's also the other physical things that we've come into contact with, or that's happening with our body, that could disqualify us temporarily. Okay, so it goes on. A woman who had just given birth might feel the presence of God so strongly in that experience that she would feel no need to go to the sanctuary to find God, although we might be more comfortable with that decision being left to the new mother rather than being written into law, right? In other words, the law here, the Torah, is preventing her from finding God in the sanctuary for a certain amount of time, whether it's 40 days or 80 days for a boy or for a girl. But it might, in modern times, you might say, well, let's wait until the woman feels that it's appropriate, as opposed to telling her when it's appropriate. And the last paragraph here, we can see the notion of tum'ah then as growing out of a sense of reverence for the miraculous nature of birth, the awesome power of death, and the mysteries of illness and recuperation. That this reverence would later be contaminated by superstitious fears related to menstrual blood and contact with the dead need not detract from our efforts to understand and appreciate these chapters of biblical law. So I'm not sure we understand them any better now. It's just clear to us that these concepts are archaic. They might seem natural, a response to bizarre things happening to our body. I mean, we can explain these things scientifically and medically now so that they're not so bizarre, but in a time of the Torah and a time of the rabbis, they were bizarre. So to respond to those bizarre things with terms like purity and impurity might not be so far-fetched. So perhaps if we try to understand it that way, as a way to try to put everything that happens in our body in this spiritual sense, maybe it doesn't seem so bizarre. Yes, Lori.
Is any of this observed today? I know not the
The
sacrifices,
only thing observed is within traditional Jewish homes, and I'd say Orthodox Jewish homes, that the woman, the married woman, does every month need to go to the mikveh for her menstrual cycle. And so that is either, that's usually around 7 to 10 days of impurity that the husband and wife are not supposed to engage in marital relations during that time. And then it's usually 7 days after she stops bleeding, then she can go to the mikveh. So there in Orthodox communities and in larger Orthodox communities, there are mikvaot, a plural of mikveh, for women to do this. And it's supposed to be done at night to add to privacy of the woman. And so, yes, this is the only thing that is still done today. Everything else that the Torah describes requires an offering to be brought in the temple. It doesn't.
okay. So a woman could have a child and go to synagogue
Yes.
just as soon as she wants to.
Absolutely. There's the bris, and then there's also the baby naming, and absolutely a woman can go to the synagogue after that. So this idea of purity also come into contact with the dead. We have there is no way to, according to the Torah, there's no way today to be able to become pure after contact with the dead. We need that special sacrifice, which we read about from the second Torah last Shabbat. And without that, we're all impure. So every single one of us is impure today. And we all are able to go to the synagogue. We symbolize ritual purity by washing our hands before saying hamotzi, washing our hands at the Passover Seder, but that's all symbolic. Washing our hands after departing a cemetery, that's not enough. You have to be sprinkled with the ashes of the red heifer. Well, until you do that, we're all impure. So yeah, it just calls into question then this whole thing today. So even within Orthodox circles, yes, that the married women going to the mikveh is still a thing, but technically speaking, we're still impure. And when you're impure, you're not supposed to come into contact with anybody else. So.
Yeah, and I'm just curious if this is too long an answer, it's fine. I could read about it or something. But what was the conservative rationale for getting rid of that requirement?
Within the conservative movement, we haven't gotten rid of the requirement for married women to go to the mikveh.
Oh, okay.
It's just that we haven't taught it, and it's not something that is yeah, I wouldn't say that it's not encouraged. There are some women within the conservative movement who do go to the mikveh. It just, I think that within the modern streams of Judaism, the non-Orthodox ones, we understand, first of all, the nature of being egalitarian. So therefore, why should the woman be the only one to go to the mikveh? Why shouldn't the man go to the mikveh too? And number two, it's all symbolic anyway.
Mhm.
So is this something that you really need to do anymore in being a spiritual, good Jewish person? So I think for the most part within the conservative movement, the mitzvah to go to the mikveh has been outweighed by these other more modern spiritual challenges that have said, you know what, it's not really necessary to do it anymore. So I have to stop here for today because I have a 12 o'clock Zoom meeting that I have to prepare to go to. So hope everybody has a very good day. And this coming Shabbat, by the way, when we are reading these three from the three Torah scrolls, we'll be celebrating Sylvia Padash's 100th birthday, and also we'll be celebrating an Ufruf as well. So it'll be hopefully be lots of simcha at services this Shabbat. So
Are you
take
going to
care,
relate
everybody.
that? How are you going to relate that to the parsha?
Don't worry. So I get paid the big bucks for finding the connections. All right, see you all next Wednesday. Take care.
Thank you.